Hello there, Azer here, back with another video. I was going to actually make a different kind of video, but since I have been playing quite a lot of other games recently, I was thinking actually it's almost the anniversary of my starter PC. So I guess it's probably a good time to review if my first ever built PC, is it worth it? Is it actually worth the price that I'm actually paying for? Basically, I'm starting out with this very basic build, the B660 motherboard, which is what they call B660 MXE. Not exactly top tier, not exactly the pro version, so yeah, very basic little small M80X kind of a motherboard, and it is only support like DDR4 and PCIe 4, I guess, so not exactly stellar to be honest, but it gets the job done. Also, it's also the LGA 1700 socket that only fits with like 12th generation and above sockets, I guess. And I heard they actually going to release a new CPU for that, but it's not really that out yet, so I don't really believe it's going to come out now at the moment, but hopefully it does, but we'll see. And then we have the CPU, it's just a normal little 12400. Now I chose this one because it has an iGPU. The reason being is because the iGPU can help me with doing a lot of quick sync stuff, like encoding videos much faster than even like the flagship GPU, so I think it's actually pretty decent, especially for the pricing as well. It's actually pretty bang for the buck, although it's not gonna perform exactly as good as like the higher versions, I suppose. And looking at this, hopefully the Bartlett Lake CPUs can actually replace this with a much better performance-wise CPU in the future, but we'll see about that. Other than that, well, I have a normal sticks of RAM. They are pretty generic brands, but it gets the job done. It's just some 3000 megahertz RAM with CL16. I don't really know what these numbers meant, but at least both of the sticks are 16 gigabytes of RAM, so in total I have 32 gigs. I guess it's kind of overkill for this build, but I suppose it's still better than not having enough RAM, I guess. 32 gigabytes of RAM is like the kind of okay-ish point to stop at, because apparently there are certain games that is going to use like more than 16 gigabytes of RAM in the future, especially like newer titles. They're technically going to use even more RAM than usual, especially depending on what GPU you're using. So yeah, I guess 32 gigabytes is pretty decent, because not only it's going to help me out with rendering work faster, and also like maybe in the future if I wanted to dabble into AI stuff, but yeah, it's actually pretty decent for me to actually do multitasking with opening a lot of like browser windows and while still game decent. Later on, we also have like the power supply. Now, I know bronze power supply, 650 watts, not exactly stellar. I mean, sure, you could have gone with like silver or gold 80 plus or something, but for my starter PC, I don't really want to break my bank, so I gone with just the most basic, you know, okay-ish Cooler Masters parts, I suppose, because that is the only power supply that I think is available at that time, I guess. Then I also go with like this GPU, which is the star of the show. It's an Intel Arc A770 16 gigabytes of RAM, VRAM, which is actually pretty nice considering the fact that this GPU performs only like 3060 if I'm not wrong, and it's fine. Now, sure, you might argue that the pricing at the moment is just not worth it, and you might as well just go with A750, but The problem with the A750 is that it has 8 GB of VRAM, which is, well, not really that enough at all for gaming nowadays. So 16 GB of VRAM is still better than a lot of like GPUs that doesn't have that much VRAM as well, and it's also still better than 12 GB because apparently there are some 1440p games that actually use more than 12 GB of VRAM or just approaching that number already. So 16 GB of VRAM is actually decent. Now, of course, you might argue that 16 GB of VRAM is kind of overkill, but I think it's because this card is supposed to be a workstation card. So the 16 GB of VRAM is going to help out in workstation tasks like video editing or encoding or recording or streaming. All of those things are gonna work pretty well, especially with a lot of headroom of the VRAM this GPU provides. Now it's also white color, which is kinda different color than the rest of my build, but I'm not exactly a fan of aesthetics, especially when it comes to like my first ever built GPU, so it's fine. I also turn off all of the, the RGB lighting, so it's alright for me. And it's pretty nice. It served me pretty well at the time. And yeah, in my case, it's actually a pretty basic Cooler Master 310 Elite or something. There's not really that much elite about this case, I guess. It's usable. It has front fans and that's it. Originally, I was going to add in another fan on the back, but since I'm not exactly using an extremely powerful CPU and GPU, it's fine actually. So yeah, I can feel the hot air coming out from the back of the computer actually, so it's actually doing very, very well to expel the heat out of the computer, I guess. So hey, what do I think of this PC in 2025? I think you've rarely seen a lot of people who actually talk about the Alchemist cards now, especially with the Battle Mage cards being so popular nowadays, right? But I'll be real here, right? It's not in the best place ever. Like, I think the A770 should cost less, especially with the B580 is actually now the flagship now. But the only saving grace I can say of the A770 in comparison with the B580 is that, well, at least it has 16 GB of VRAM, which allows you to run certain games, especially ray tracing heavy games, or games that has very, very high texture amounts like Call of Duty games or something like that, those games at least would have enough VRAM to run, especially on high textures or epic or 4K textures, I suppose. But yeah, this card is not gonna do above 4K, I suppose, because I mean, if you want to play 4K, it's fine, but you are probably only able to play like indie games or esport titles in 4K, but other than that, the modern titles are fine. You are not going to get like flagship amount of the flagship experience in terms of like gaming with this GPU, but for me it's suffice. Actually, it's actually fine because I'm able to play latest titles at the moment, and especially games that are like DirectX 12 or are done, or the games that are made in Unreal Engine 5. Now, of course, performance issues and stuff are still there, and drivers could have been better, but so far I've been using an old driver that has the recording function, which also is compatible with the WGC. That means I can actually record games that are running in 30 frames per second, but is upscaled on, or the frame gen is like on 2x, so the game looks pretty smooth, but technically the game is actually 30 frames per second. And I can do that because the Intel software, apparently the old version actually allows you to capture it. So who knows, right? That's the reason why I actually like it as well, because it allows you to capture an AV1 encoding, which this GPU does very, very well. Now, of course, you might argue, hey, why did I stick with an older GPU? Well, it's because of Monster Hunter Wilds. Unfortunately, if I were to use the latest GPU drivers, unfortunately, the game performance is just really bad. So I just realized I found out in the Intel Arc Reddit that somebody actually ran an older GPU driver that is in beta, and it apparently has doubles the performance of the newest drivers. So you know what? I decided to just stick with this old driver here, and it just is performing in games. It helps me to gain more performance in the worst case scenario games like Space Marine 2 and Monster Hunter Wilds, where usually it only can play those games in like less than 30 frames per second, sometimes even at the 20s, which is even worse. But now with this old driver, I can actually run those games natively at 40 frames per second or sometimes higher, but and then still retaining a little bit of a game detail. At least the quality of the games are still fine, but I still, am able to play them in a decent frame rate, I suppose. And yeah, if you don't really mind frame generation as a technology, like utilizing lossless scaling and maybe a little bit of a DLSS swapper and maybe swapping out the XeSS versions of newer games so that they can support the latest XeSS 2, well, I think this card is gonna do fine, especially in games where they allow you to utilize the XeSS technology, because this card has enough XeSS cores that it will be able to actually utilize XeSS2 technology. So whenever a game has XeSS low latency or XeSS frame generation, it actually can utilize it fully in comparison to like the newer Battle Mage cards. So hey, it's still way better than like being locked behind DLSS newer versions like in Nvidia cards or the AMD cards, where FSR, if you wanted to use the latest version of FSR, you had to buy the latest game GPUs or some things, which is pretty limiting considering how expensive the newer GPUs are at the moment with this economic crisis happening and the GPU prices being so high because of the tariffs and everything. So yeah, it makes no sense for me to go for higher tiers of GPU at the moment because of all those fluctuating prices. However, I heard Intel is going to release more powerful Battle Mage cards in the future. Hopefully they are going to release them in decent prices, not like the same like overinflated prices like what AMD and Nvidia has been doing at the moment. Hopefully their GPUs are also pretty decent in comparison to the current Battle Mage B580 as well, because I remember that, if I'm not wrong, my card is a 770 version. So yeah, it makes sense for us to just continually use this card instead of actually upgrading to the new one. But hey, that's personal preference. If you can find a B580 for MSRP, I think it's gonna definitely be a way more better purchase than the A770, despite having lower VRAM, because the performance of B580, it's worth it if you want to decide to have a much more stable experience in comparison to the A770, which is still struggling in a lot of like later games. But I am keeping A770 because it actually records video and records the gameplay and streams the gameplay very decently because of the high VRAM amount. So yeah, I'm gonna use this GPU even after I purchase a new one, because it's gonna be my workstation GPU, and it's doing very well. People don't really expect them to do, which is releasing a GPU of themselves. And hopefully the Intel Arc series moving forward is going to be way better than whatever that we are getting at the moment. And hopefully the prices of the Intel Alchemist cards are gonna drop faster, because at this price, unfortunately, there's much better alternatives that people can actually choose from the AMD side. So that's the reason why the Alchemist cards is kind of like pretty very underrated at the moment. But if you have no choice and the B580 and B570s are just way too over MSRP for you, or for your taste, well, you can probably nab an A770 that is at least 16GB of VRAM, and you'll be able to do a lot of workstation stuff or AI stuff pretty well, especially with that much of a VRAM. So, in the end, is this PC worth it? Yes. And not to mention the Bartlett Lake CPUs that is going to come out in the future by Intel. There is going to be new CPUs able to be fit on the LGA 1700 platform. So who knows? Maybe I can continue using this PC, or if the performance gains are just negligible, at least I can upgrade to a different motherboard that is way better than this. Maybe in the future when there's new technologies coming in. But hey, as a starter PC that costs like $800 to $900 at the time when I'm buying this, I'm satisfied, because with this amount of money, I can actually obtain myself a 1440p and mini LED HDR monitor as well, which is actually pretty nice because it costs the same like as my GPU. So hey, it's actually pretty decent. So my plans going forward with this PC would be upgrading or maybe getting a way better GPU and CPU. But in the case of like getting into DDR5 or beyond, that will be a future thing, because at the moment, upgrading from a DDR4 to DDR5, the upgrade is really minor. It does not really warrant a higher price to get a new motherboard completely just to upgrade to the newer platform. So I think I'm gonna stick with DDR4 at the moment, and yeah, hopefully DDR6 or future platforms, PCIe 7 platform is actually much more affordable than whatever the PCIe 5 platform is at the moment. So that's the video I wanted to make today. I hope you actually enjoyed this review of my starter PC at the moment, and hopefully you can, learn a thing or two about Intel Arc GPUs from this video. So, well, if you like my content, you can leave a like and maybe subscribe please if you can, because I'm trying to reach 1K, and every single subscribe and like is going to help me and benefit me extremely. Thank you very much. Acer signing out. Sayonara.